Hello and welcome to Roster Doctor, where we fix up your roster. For this inaugural episode, I'm joined by the one and only Tseung Tsu from across the Bifrost and a lot of other cool Marvel Crisis Protocol content. How's it going?
I'm great, Mark. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate being here.
Yeah, so we first met in our tail end of our War Machine careers, and then we kind of both moved over to Crisis Protocol. I think both of us really enjoyed getting into like the tactical content of it and how deep it is compared to a lot of other miniatures games. Would you agree?
Are we talking about War Machine or Marvel there for the tactical depth?
Well, a bit of column A, bit of column B. I think that there's a lot of similarities between the two.
Yeah, I think we appreciate the depth of the game. We appreciate like a high level of competition. And it might have been the end of your War Machine career. My War Machine career, quote unquote, was brief. It was bright. It was like a shooting star. I only traveled competitively for a year, so that was kind of my whole shebang.
Yeah, my serious run was only a bit longer. I think I had like 2 years where I was like actually making final day cuts. Um, I was going to a decent amount of cons for about 5 years, but I wasn't that serious on it. If it As soon as I realized I was capable of winning, I started putting in a lot more effort.
Yeah, so obviously, like Marvel Crisis Protocol as hopefully has that. You know, when the world comes down, isn't on fire. I'm excited to see what the convention scene looks like. But for now, yeah, I'm excited to talk about rosters, fix them up. It's such a big hurdle for Marvel Crisis Protocol. I feel the amount of like list building options are kind of crazy. It almost rivals like Warhammer 40K. It's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, so I think we had this discussion a few months ago. I know Pat was involved in it. I don't remember if you stuck your head in, but I was kind of like talking about the breakdown of list building, play on the table, and what was the third aspect? Dice. Like what percentage each impacted on your win rate. And so I kind of placed War Machine as one of the lowest where list building matters. Because like after a certain point, you can make garbage lists, but once you know how to make decent lists, it's very hard to get an edge past that from what I experienced. Whereas in Crisis Protocol, there's a lot of complexity into your roster building that I think is going to lend to it having a higher percentage of your what contributes to your wins as being list construction. And 40K, obviously, in my opinion, is by far the most list based. I often like to joke that 40K is a game where you spend hours upon hours building your list, and then you spend 4 hours rolling buckets of dice just to make sure that you actually did win at list construction.
Uh, in an effort to stay on target, I won't comment about 40K or War Machine. Uh, I I think that Marvel Crisis Protocol is a game of incremental advantage. I don't. I personally think actually fully understanding and knowing situations your models can be in and what they're capable of is the most important thing in Crisis Protocol. But you can gain yourself incremental advantages through list building, and I think that's really important. And I think that's what we're trying to convey here in Roster Doctor.
Yeah, and ideally just kind of opening up the maximum amount of options so that you feel good on any scenario. Because since you only have control over half of the scenario, it's not like War Machine or 40K where you play to a packet of like 6 different missions. Uh, in Crisis Protocol, the missions are actually built into your list building process, and you have to anticipate what your opponent's doing. And especially now that more and more secure crises are coming out, the number of possible what's it called crisis combinations, yeah, is exploding. So I think putting a lot of thought into how you build your roster is something that's going to get discussed more and more.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll go over that when we talk about crises. I mean, at one level, if you're just ready for like deployment, I think that's fantastic. There are certain lists that are really going to thrive on that and others that aren't. And then getting into the subtle nuances of like, okay, how are the Ds different from each other? You know, when's a good time to take this one? When's a good time to take that one? That's kind of another thing. And that's why I really talk about incremental advantage there, right? Even just planning for D crises is going to be an advantage. Planning for the, in particular, the specific ones is going to get you another advantage. But I feel like I'm getting ahead of ourselves here. We haven't even talked about a roster yet.
Yep. So, real quick, I just want to go over the format of this show. So basically, each episode we're going to introduce a new roster with tactics, crises, and characters. We're going to go over possible teams for every threat level, and then we're going to go over 3 randomized scenario combinations, and then we're going to talk about changes we'd potentially like to do. But with that, why don't we just hop straight into looking at the roster? So first, we're going to go over the characters real quick. This roster that we're using for the inaugural episode is a combination of Wakanda Wave and Web Warriors. So I like to call it WW for short. Um, so we've got Black Panther, Killmonger, Shuri, Okoye, Spider-Man, Ghost Spider, other Spider-Man, Venom, Valkyrie, and Thor. Um, and so this is obviously built to either play kind of the bog standard Wakanda Wave, which is Black Panther, Shuri, Okoye, Valkyrie, and then we're kind of replacing Doc Ock with presumably Miles. That's what a lot of people have been talking about recently. And then conversely, you can play the Web Warriors package and kind of play that more mobile, uh, holding extracts and running away style of game, if that fits your scenario a bit better.
Yeah, so both teams are trying to win. Neither one of these is an attrition team in the way that they're going to table you, right? We're not taking on like our Corvus Glaive Black Order roster here. They are trying to win a scenario, but they're doing it very different ways. I like the synergies between the Spider people, and I guess we'll get into roster changes later. I think one of the important things is kind of what you mentioned. You mentioned the core of Wakanda. I think the core of a Spider people roster, and I'm oversimplifying, right? But the 10 point is going to be Miles, Gwen, and Venom. With obviously Peter Parker coming in at 14, which is important when you think about higher threat games, because in order to normally maintain your character uh, dichotomy, you normally need to end up going to like a 6 person roster, including Spider Man. But the core of Web Warriors is going to be 10, right? And the normal core of the Wakanda here, right, is normally coming in closer to what, 11, I think, right?
It's 9 if you're just doing Black Panther, Shuri, Okoye. If you're including Killmonger, it's 13. Something
Yeah,
I
I guess
Go
I
ahead.
guess I normally think of like Panther, Killmonger, and Shuri being the core coming in at 11, but I understand that not everyone plays that way. And again, depends on the crisis and how you're trying to get to.
Yeah, and something I just want to point out real quick that I really like about this is one of my main complaints with playing Web Warriors so far has been sure you can play them at that 10 point core package, but it can sometimes be annoying when like the full package is 14 points, and that means it's impossible for you to play 15 point Web Warriors with everyone, which means obviously Peter has to get cut. Um, which isn't the end of the world, but I really like how that pairs with the Wakanda setup because they often very much like to play 15 threat scenarios because that's often gamma. Um, so there's kind of like a little bit of a synergy there where if you're playing against like a traditional Cabal Modoc team and they're forcing gamma wave on you, you're perfectly fine playing Wakanda. You don't have to play spiders.
Yeah, if you've listened to Man Across the Bifrost, I'm not the biggest fan of dual affiliation rosters. And the main reason is you really need a plan to use both sides of the affiliation, in my opinion. And what Mark just kind of outlined there is one of the reasons that I think this could work, right? Is in the lower threat values, I want to slide in Wakanda. At the higher threat values, I want to go with Spider People. I think that's important. I see a lot of rosters that are like clogged at the top end for a bunch of different options. And to me, that doesn't functionally matter, right? I should be building the roster to have things that execute on different crises with different threats, but I don't need 4 19 point options. So I do think there's some good synergies there within this roster.
Yeah. Let's move on to the tactics real quick. So here we've got Wakanda Forever, all webbed up, brace for impact, field dressing, lethal protector, vibranium shielding, blind obsession, and Medpack. And so this was kind of this seems a little bit more skewed towards playing a kind of Wakanda Wave style list because you've got both Wakanda Forever and vibranium shielding in there. Um, you can kind of get into some conniption fits if you're trying to play Web Warriors without Venom. Then you have to play exactly all webbed up, brace, field dressing, blind obsession, med pack. Um, but in general, I think this is just kind of playing to largely what you want to do. And I think we'll
Yeah,
get more into this on the tail end when we're talking about making swaps, because I think there's a lot of obvious candidates for making improvements here.
so tactics are the reason that I'm normally not the biggest fan of dual affiliation rosters because for some affiliations, their strength is really in the tactics cards, right? And it's the thing that we are most limited in outside of crisis cards. But when you look at the number we can take proportionate to the number that are out there, it's definitely the area we're most limited to. And I really put a high value on flexible cards that I can take for different opponents in addition to different scenarios. And what Mark kind of outlined here is one of the reasons I don't love dual affiliation rosters when we're taking a lot of specialty cards. You're often forced into 5 cards. And if you're being forced into 5 cards, what that means is if your opponent is savvy, they know what you're playing. And like if they know that you shouldn't get in a land war with Italians, then you end up in a bad situation. You can lose some incremental advantage there.
Yeah, definitely. Let's switch over to Crises real quick because I think this is going to be one of the meatier parts, considering this is such a scenario-focused team. So for extracts, we've got alien ship crashes in downtown, Skrulls infiltrate world leadership, and mystic Wakandan herbs factor fiction. For secures, we have cosmic invasion, Black Order descends on Earth, Riot spark over Extremist 3.0, and gamma wave sweeps across Midwest. So, the way I see the split here is that when you get secures, you're trying to force gamma waves so that you can play your bog standard Wakanda team at 15 points. When you get extracts, you're trying to play a kind of keep away game where you put something on Miles and run him away and try and generate a big advantage there.
Yeah, so this isn't the order that I normally go in, right? I normally like to think about where my teams are going to fit in. I mean, we kind of know that, right? Wakanda obviously handles Gamma Wave pretty well. So is that where you're most advantaged? I mean, it depends on your list, right? So in those situations, we want blues. The reds are interesting. I struggle to understand when we're going to want to take Wakandan Herb. It just seems like such a dichotomy to the other two. I know you've had pretty good luck with Spider People on it. I understand the
Yeah,
logic behind it, but most that just doesn't fit with scrolls and alien ships in my mind, if that makes sense. So
it's
that's
the
like the
closest to
curveball
being
in there, right?
cut, and yeah, it's the closest to being cut in my book. Um, I think I've had a hard time telling whether it's just people not knowing how to go for the throat against Web Warriors yet, because like with season 2 of the league, and I think season 1, Wakanda Wave was doing a lot better earlier on, and then as people started to understand the give and take of the matchup, their popularity and win rate started to go down. So I think maybe my love of Wakandan herbs is just because people haven't played enough into Web Warriors that they know how to solve that kind of game plan.
Yeah, maybe. Again, I just think that there are some better extracts we could throw out there. We'll talk about replacements later, I guess. So that's just the one that kind of jumps out to me that doesn't really fit.
Yeah. Um,
It's also worth noting that you can always push a D deployment if you want for your secure with Cosmic Invasion and Riots and Extremist Console. So I think that's important to outline as well.
yes, and I also think that both Cosmic and Riots are scenarios that the Spiders love a lot because one of the biggest problems I've seen so far is that they really struggle to get power round 2. Uh, they tend to be either empty or on 1, uh, ending round 1, and so they really want 1 or 2 power to be able to start really doing stuff going into the next round. And Cosmic Invasion can give you a lot of power, and then since they're so mobile, they don't really care about being pushed, especially if you get to control the direction to some degree.
Yeah, I agree. Right. I mean, Web Warriors in general struggle for early game power generation, whether we want to call that turn 1, turn 2, whatever. So anything you can do to boost that makes sense.
Yep. With that, why don't we just do a quick run through of the threat levels and the teams we like to see at those. So first, we've got the 15 threat teams here. There's a pretty decent split of Wakanda and spiders. I think in general, you're probably playing Wakanda because most of the times when you're playing 15, it means you're playing Gamma. So you could be playing herbs. Um, so for the kind of standard 15 threat team, assuming I'm playing Gamma, I would very much like to be playing something like Black Panther, Miles, Shuri, Okoye, Valkyrie. I think that's a very solid core for being able to control that column up the middle.
So I assume that we are assuming that the listeners have some core knowledge of what Wakanda Wave is here, right? We don't have to break down that to them.
Yeah, I'm treating this as kind of something of a intermediate level podcast where these are the kinds of people who are playing in the tabletop simulator league and are keeping up on a lot of the content, and so this is more about like a deeper dive into the existing meta rather than necessarily introducing concepts. But as a quick little recap for our listeners, Wakanda Wave is a scenario focused Wakanda based team where you take advantage of pushes and throws to be able to control Gamma Wave and score up a ton of points in the early to middle game and try and ride that out.
Yeah, you also tend to be wider than traditional 15-point teams, so you normally end up giving up priority, but you don't have that single target they can really focus down, which a lot of teams are kind of built around doing, like Cabal or something like that. So I do think that's a great roster that you shouted out there. So what are the other rosters that your opponent needs to be aware of on this, though? Because again, I feel like if we only have one roster, that can be a little worrisome. And I agree that would be the roster I'm running. But is there another one here that jumps out at you?
So let's say you're playing 15 herbs for some reason and it's not wave sweeps across Midwest. I would look at something like Miles, Shuri, Venom, Okoye, Ghost Spider. Um, I think that's just a solid all round team. You have two characters that can protect Miles once he picks up the herbs in the form of Lethal Protector on Venom and then Okoye's Bodyguard. You've got Shuri to hand out rerolls, and you've also actually you can protect him even more with Gwen. So you can really set up a situation where Miles picks up that herb, and he will just never die.
Yeah, and I think some of it depends on the secure you're going for too, right? The only roster I want to shout out here is actually I really like what the Web Warriors core we talked about, which is Miles, Gwen, Venom, and then you just tack Thor on top of it.
Oh yeah,
I think that can catch a lot of people by surprise. It's actually it's shockingly resilient. In addition to just like they don't care about any of the terrain obstacles or flying or wall crawling or wall crawling over everything, and it puts out pretty good damage. So you can definitely catch some people by surprise if they're expecting you to play this kind of like push control scenario game, and you're just like, I'm just gonna daze people and see what happens.
yeah. I can definitely see the value in that when you want to try and gear shift into a bit of a more fighty team, and it
Yep, it's
lets you
always good to
control
have Avengers.
priority. Uh, Another somewhat attractive one to me is Miles, Black Panther, Peter, Venom. I think that team's incredibly tanky. Um, and if you want to play like a midline board where you're like playing to the middle and you just never want to go down, I think that's a really solid team that'll take forever to burn through with all their rerolls and defensive abilities.
Hmm. That's probably my least favorite of the ones we mentioned. Just traditionally speaking, I don't particularly like. I'm exaggerating here for the purposes of we are on the internet. I traditionally would prefer an aggressive strategy, whether that's scenario or attrition based, over a tanky one. The dice are just like inherent. Like if you spike dice on a good defensive roll, nothing happens. If you spike dice on a good attack, right, obviously you end up with a daze or an advantage situation. So I understand what you're saying about it being a resilient team. It's just it's not the way that I personally like playing the game, but I guess it's good to mention it. I I
Yeah,
kind of have to
it's
reach
definitely more
pretty
of a shout out.
far, yeah, pretty far into the bag for me to be like, this is the team I want to run, right? Like I'm having a hard time thinking of the crisis for it.
Yeah, I think like we've got our like bog standard wave team, we've got our bog standard herbs team, and we've got a pretty good fighting team. So when will you need a tanky team? Though it is something to consider if you really think that's going to work for some reason. I think that's the fourth best option. Let's say. Um, let's
Yeah,
move
that's
on
fair.
to
Just like if we're playing 15, right? We're either playing Gamma Shelters or Herbs, right? So since like we have good rosters for them, like I just don't understand when that's going to come up. But I'm with you.
yeah. Let's move on to 16 threat right now. And unless I'm mistaken, the only scenario that's 16 right now is the new Spider Portal scenario, which ironically, Web Warriors don't really
Uh,
seem to want to play.
so Spider Portals is actually 18. I think you're a little flipped.
Who am I
Black Order,
thinking?
right? Cosmic Invasion Black Order descends on Earth is the 16, which is the D secure.
You are correct. My brain is not working. Uh, um, yep.
And
So,
I actually think spiders want to play on portals overrun with spider people, but we can talk about that later. So if we're playing 16, we're playing the 16 secure we just talked about. You can check that out on Assemble, which if you don't have it on your mobile phone, you should. It was a
shameless ad
fantastic piece of
time.
software. Yeah, it's me though, so I can do that. You don't have to. So what teams do you really like at 16 for this? Keeping in mind that we're playing on a D secure here.
Yeah, so D secure, you want either range 5 or you want straight up brawlers with high mobility. Range 4 doesn't really cut it. Um, so I think you're probably going to want to play some kind of Web Warrior shell with Shuri.
Yeah, I agree. I actually want Gwen and I want Shuri in my list. Those are the two things that I want the most. And then obviously we can't have all these things, but I also want Miles and Black Panther. So kind of where we choose to go after that. I mean, I guess we could have all of those. Yeah, okay, those fit point wise, but
Yeah, so the one that actually popped out to me the most is Miles, Shuri, Venom, Gwen, and Valkyrie. I really like that just kind of generally. Um, Shuri can hang back on a home point, and then you have Miles and Gwen pair up, and then Venom and Valkyrie pair up, or you could do any combination of those two pairs, and you send like two clumps of two forwards, and you just brawl. And I think you'll be mostly happy with the results from there.
yeah, I don't think we need to belabor this too much. I mean, obviously the range 5 is important for where you can stand and still interact with the board in the D scenario. Shuri is a fantastic piece there. I really appreciate Gwen's flexibility and mobility here. She's one of the characters that can like move, make an attack, and still get back onto her point or an opposing point, which I think is really powerful. I think the pulls that all the spider people bring are actually super relevant for this too. So going wide on number of activations makes sense. I don't think I'd want to play any of the four character ones. I think I'd want to be 5 characters. In these particular ones, playing for this, I would almost highly prioritize the end activation, so I can just okay, you're going to do this character. That's great. I'm going to pull them off the point. We're just going to keep moving on. So I think that's a great roster. I don't. Again, 16 is pretty narrow because there's only one crisis. I don't think there's too much to kind of belabor here.
Yeah. Just to where was it? I saw a roster that essentially did exactly what you wanted. Uh,
It gets a little weird. The roster I want to play ends up 1 point short.
yeah. I was trying to find one that gets Miles, Gwen, Shuri, and Black Panther in it. Um, I guess you could do that
Yeah,
with Valkyrie. Yeah.
yeah. Valkyrie's
Oh,
not my
but
favorite
no,
on the.
that's affiliation list. That's the problem.
Yeah, so we end up in some weird spots there. I just the roster I want to play, excuse me, the team I want to play with this roster just doesn't happen. But again, that's a personal preference thing, and I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just different.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to by far the most common threat value in Marvel Crisis Protocol, which is 17 threat. And as you can see from the options listed here, it's, I think, 2 more than the next highest, which is 18 in terms of possible permutations. So there's a lot of stuff to consider here. At 17, it, it's hard to nail down like a particular what's it called team because there's so much variance in the kinds of scenarios you're going to see. It's not like there's only 1 or 2 scenarios you have to plan for. Um,
Yeah, so I think the way I approach it is I look at, okay, 17 threat, super wide. What 17s am I bringing? And let's at least have a plan for those, right? Because those are really really popular, right? And I think we have Skrulls and we have extremists. So extremists again, being that D scenario, I'm going to prioritize anything that is like super mobile and range 5. So again, I want Shuri and Ghost Spider in my list if possible. 17 threat also to me is the point where we start seeing really really tuned up angry beaters is what I'll say, for lack of a better term. Right? Corvus and Proxima start showing up. You start seeing weird Thanos lists with gems tacked onto them. The Modoc Cabal list just gets a little better as like Modoc continues to gain steam and additional support pieces. So you have to have something to be able to deal with them. But before we get that far, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. I look at my own personal crises and I try to make sure I can handle that. So I don't think there's anything else we need to add for extremists. So what do you think for Skrulls? Like, what is your Skrulls roster out of this?
So scrolls, I was talking about this a bit with herbs, but I think web warriors are incredibly good at a keep away strategy, where you try and pick it up on Miles or Peter, or even Gwen, though she's a little bit less easy to hide and keep safe than the other two. Um, so I'm looking at something like Miles, Peter, Gwen, Venom, Shuri. I've played this a lot at 17 points, and I've been pretty happy every single time. I think I'm 2-2 against you when we've played this in the dojo.
Uh,
Um,
I don't know. I'd have to look at my spreadsheet. I believe you.
yeah, but I know that basically every single time I've lost, it's basically come down to can I use literally every single turn I've got this round to kill Miles, or I concede, because he's holding herbs or the scroll or something, right? Um, and the fact that games are coming down to must do a TKO or I lose is very promising to me. And I think with better play, I could have made that into a very reliably forcible strategy.
Sure, I think that's great. I think that's fine. I do want to mention like we haven't. Actually, no. Let's keep going. So I don't think I have anything else to add to 17. My big piece of advice is if you're going through your own roster, just make sure that you have plans for your 17s. Um,
Yep.
there's so many out there. Like it's great to have plans for all of them, but realistically, like if you have plans for your 17s, I think you'll do okay moving on to other ones.
Yeah, and extremists, you can play a very similar D strategy. I think actually, even the roster I just mentioned is incredibly good at D. You put Shuri on your home one, and then you do two flank teams. If you want to be a little bit more fighty, you can swap Gwen out for Valkyrie, and I think you won't be too unhappy with that.
You lose a lot of mobility in my mind, but yeah, you're definitely a little more smashy smash.
Yeah, if you think you need to sit on the secure because the extract isn't getting you anywhere, that's when I would consider it. But most of the
Oh,
time, I like to default for picking up the extracts and like trying to interact with the secures as little as possible to make sure I'm up on VPs.
all I'll say with Valkyrie is like if you don't position her perfectly, she can't get from one D to another. There are situations where she can't, right? Gwen, she's very forgiving in that way. She can always get from a D to a D.
Yeah,
Does that
yeah,
make sense? So that's why I just prioritize her just a little bit higher. There are times when like you're refused flank, it's great, you're winning it. Now I've got too many characters there. I need to get off of it. I need to spread back out. I need to apply more scenario pressure. Valkyrie has a harder time making that pivot. Valkyrie also has a harder time making the pivot of okay, this flank I thought Venom and Miles over here were going to be fine. I need to go support them. It takes Valkyrie like a full turn of just like derping to get over there, where Gwen can like get to the middle or to the north or south D's and still influence the board with her pull and her lifesaver ability. The name eludes me.
it's not Webline. Oh God, that's
That's
gonna
what I
haunt
said.
me for the rest of my days.
The lifesaver ability. His name eludes me. That's fine.
Yeah.
Everyone knows what I'm talking about. Oh, it's
Uh,
literally called lifesaver. Nailed it.
oh my God. Well, with that, why don't we kick on over to 18 threat? So this is going to be the new spider portals. What's the other 18? There's a second 18 rolling around here right now.
Hammers.
Oh yeah, hammers, the classic. A lot of people really love taking hammers in their web warriors teams.
Yeah,
I
I don't.
haven't so much, just because I don't like the wide web warriors strategy with extracts. I like to do the single keep away, but it's not the end of the world. So here,
So it's worth noting that we're not bringing in 18. So when we're going over this, we're preparing for someone else to bring this 18 into us. And hammers is extremely popular. So I do think that one in particular you need an answer for. And later on, I'm going to try to sell Mark on why Web Warriors wants to play Portals over on City with Spider People. But 18 threat. What are you thinking here, Mark?
so the number one assumption I'm going into here is that if you're seeing hammers, you're probably playing against Cabal Modoc. Um,
I think you might be playing Guardians as well.
yeah, well, I think Guardians, Avengers, and Cabal all love it. Probably Asgard too. Most teams love it because
I don't think Avengers loves it, but we can get into that later. That's a whole
yeah,
nother. It's a whole nother podcast.
but Cabal is kind of like the premier fighty affiliation right now. I feel like Guardians stock is at an all-time low. Asgard is there, but they've never been competing with Cabal. So I would say the most common thing you're going to see is Cabal. But I think a lot of affiliations are going to bring this out. But for Cabal in particular, I really love having Thor because Modoc hates getting staggered, like more than anything else. So being able to do a move into a 4 Asgard on turn 2 outside of Modoc's range and stagger him and throw him away is such a huge bonus. Especially if you can throw something size 3 plus at him. You can basically half kill him and then follow up on the next turn.
Yeah, and I think that's really strong. I agree. I think Thor is a fantastic addition to the roster. So who would you kind of build around Thor then? Like, what do you think you'd actually want to drop on the table?
Thor and Shuri, I think, are the two priorities, which means I'm looking at something like Miles, Thor, Shuri, Venom, Gwen.
See, that's where my eye went to, and that's kind of the first roster that I think I'd want to play. And I'm not gonna lie, I think we seriously need to consider whether we want to play Wakanda here. Like the main reason we're playing them is like we've decided to bring Gamma. Like I think there are better things we can do and we can tune this roster a little bit more. I don't think we need to be as wide in these Wakandans as we need to be, especially to the point we're taking 2 tactics cards, right? But anyway, I'll humor it for the rest of the podcast episode here. I think that's where I'd want to be as well. I think it's a good roster. It's a good blend. You could even play that into like any of the Corvus Proxima reality gem lists and be okay, right? Thor is pretty decent into them. Venom into Corvus is like a really interesting, weird, do you get Wild's timing trigger game? It's good to reinforce your rules. You're still pretty mobile as far as getting out there, grabbing hammers and moving things around. So I like it for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you could play those on any one of them.
So before we wrap up on 18 threat, you said you wanted to sell me on portals for spiders. So for this team, Miles, Thor, Shuri, Peter, or Venom, Gwen. How do you see this working out so well for them? Because the way I see it is you're probably so Shuri goes onto the middle one. She's going to flip that, and then you're going to have some combination like Miles Venom, Shuri, or not Shuri, Gwen Thor, or something like that, going to each of the side ones, right? Um, and do you not feel vulnerable at all for flipping those round one and going into round two?
I think you feel vulnerable, right? But I think you have to fall back on what Web Warriors has is that it's like slightly above average tanky stats. I think the other thing that you can really leverage here is there are a lot of lists where precision placement are really important. And that scenario can really muck that up because of the way that the teleportation works, right? The placing effect that the opposing player gets to roll, correct? So
Yeah,
I feel like you can recover from that a lot easier than opponents can. And I think it's something that you can continue to punish people for. So
that's fair, and I can
let's take a
kind of
Modoc
see
list, for example, right? When are you going to flip one of those things with Modoc?
never. Red
Because
Skull's
if you
gonna
get
do it.
that negative 2-inch place with MODOK, that's a really big thing, right? And there's lots of lists that are kind of built around characters like this. Like Corvus and Proxima, it's actually really scary there too. I know at 18, the Corvus normally has the reality gem, so like the odds of this happening are pretty darn low. But if for some bizarre reason you're not running the reality gem, if you look at some of the other beaters, that place effect can be very devastating. We combine that with getting the all webbed up out there, maybe earlier than we normally would. If we get the power generation for it, I think you can do some interesting things with just like general board denial. I'm able to kind of ignore this negative effect and move around a lot better than you are. If your opponent is playing any of these beater lines, let's think like, Valkylla, uh, Thor, right? Moving them around a little bit still has like a strong impact on them. They're not slow, but they're not fast, and I feel like you're better able to leverage the things that Web Warriors are really good at to counteract some of the more aggressive beater teams.
Yeah, I can see that. I think the mobility is less of an issue, and you definitely have a big advantage there. It's more about can you get the power, and I guess with having an Asgardian, um, especially Thor, who's incredibly good at flipping these because of his 4 energy defense, you're in a spot where you feel comfortable being able to do that.
Yeah, again, I know we don't have a ton of 4 energy defense out there, but I think that combined with Shuri always pushing things around, like I think you can end up with like a really frustrating game for your opponent as they struggle with like, okay, do I move to start beating on something or do I have to take this different move in order to interact with this? And you can put them in some weird scenarios that way. I think it messes up melee beater aggro attrition teams like really, really hard to have to deal with this kind of thing. And for that reason, I think it's a good nod for Web Warriors who really want nothing to do with mucking it up and fighting with people. That's one of the other reasons too that I think Spider Invade Manhattan is a good consideration as well.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that with the high level of mobility. I like that. Let's kick over to 19th threat, which guarantees right now that you're playing civilians. I don't know the actual proper name for it. Panic grips city as evacuation efforts continue. So this is the one with the 4 civilians that you can cash in.
Yeah, it's the one where you execute civilians to get 2 VPs. It's kind of
Yeah,
gruesome.
execute. Yeah, we ritualistically murder the civilians so that we can claim victory. I think this is another one where I really like Thor. You like using his builder attack a lot, and the fact that he generates 2 every round means that it's not at all unlikely that you aren't picking up a civilian round 1 and then cashing it in either round 2 or round 3 with a fair amount of reliability.
Yeah, this is actually one of those times that I actually it's rare for me to do this, but I'm gonna say like I actually really like Miles, Thor, Valkyrie, Parker, Venom on this one. I like the double eyes guardians because I really do appreciate their power generation. Like we still have 3 pulls to pull models into kind of the blender that is Valkyrie and Thor kind of cashing on people there.
Yep.
I think it's also really cute to Venom Blast a civilian off, right? And then, depending on the location, I can pick it up with Valkyrie and cash the thing out. So I really like the double Avengers kind of leveraging the power generation there. I think we kind of highlighted it earlier, right? One of the issues with Web Warriors is generating power early mid game. And what I'll say following that up is like they have a hard time getting to 6 power by themselves. Unless you're beating on Miles or something, it takes a lot for him to end up at the 6 power threshold. He normally has to expend power to get more power, so he ends up like basically felching himself. So I really appreciate the Avengers coming in.
Yeah, so in my experience, if you're able to get to 3 with them before the key piece activates on round 2, you're able to get off a big all webbed up where you essentially max out on power and then you're fine for the rest of the game. But it's really hard to get to that 3, especially because Miles is moving aggressively to pick up and extract typically. So he's going to start round 2 at 1 and he has to find 2 out of kind of nowhere. Um,
Yeah, he
or
has to
like,
find 2 out of nowhere, right? And he's also not web swinging in order to do it.
yeah.
And then like if your opponent doesn't clear or deal with the slow for the all webbed up, right, you can definitely charge up the other characters, but there's obviously positioning complaint or restraints, and obviously the game happens there, right? I just like, Thor and Valkyrie get to a turn. This is great. They have more power. like you said, they also have slightly advantage aggro, so they can normally just end up with enough to kind of execute some civilians for those extra ones. And then it's an interesting game of like when you choose to execute the civilians. Like, do I need the short term generation here? Do I want the longer term? If I have two secured, I'm obviously going to try to execute yours. Things like that. So it's a great game. It's interesting, and again, it's one of those weird times where I would leave Gwen at home. But I think if you want to go with the all webbed up strategy, I think you almost need to drop 4 web warriors at that stage, right? And that brings you at 14 points, Thor to 15, right? So you would just be swapping out Valkyrie for Gwen.
Yeah, I I think Valkyrie and Gwen are interchangeable here. They're obviously the two swaps. Um, but yeah, I think I very much err towards taking Valkyrie, unless there's something really weird going on with the secure.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a B placement, so the movement's not quite as severe. Like, I really like Valkyrie on this. Like, she could go either east or west, right, and reasonably interact with 2 different points over there. I personally really leaning towards that 4 Valkyrie list.
Yep, in agreement. Finally, we're going to go on to 20 threat, which is a secure that we're taking. Alien ship crashes in downtown, which, as we stated earlier on here, is almost assuredly going to be a Web Warriors team. So here you're trying to look to play Miles Keep Away, which means that you want Miles and Gwen.
I think you want Miles, Gwen, and Venom for Lethal Protector, personally.
Yeah, and so that puts you up to 10, and then you have to find 10 more points out of that.
And the problem with the roster as constructed is we don't have 2 5s to drop in, so we end up having to go wide, right?
Yeah, because we either break our affiliation, or we have to play Wakanda, which I don't think we want to do here. I mean, I guess you could and just play Miles in Wakanda, Miles and Gwen potentially. Actually,
Means
no,
you don't
there's
have
no
lethal.
legal roster where you can take both.
Um,
Because of the way the math works out in the characters, there's no affiliated roster you can take with both of them.
yeah, not leaving a point on the table. Sure, I'm with you.
Yeah. Um, yeah, this is one of those weird scenarios where I'd almost like to play a point down and play our 19-point team. Which I
Yeah,
think,
you don't actually want to do that. You actually want to go back, change the roster so you can have some more compelling
yeah, yeah,
gameplay
yeah,
options.
yeah. I think that's an obvious symptom that, but
So,
um,
right, are we playing Wakanda on 20?
no,
Are we playing Wakanda on 19?
we're pretty much only playing Wakanda on 15. Well, so that's the thing. We can play it theoretically on, I think, virtually any threat level if the other player is selecting the threat value on a herbs something table, right? So if we were playing like, or not herbs, gamma
Gamma.
wave and alien ship, I think we maybe actually potentially play Wakanda here. And then you could do something like full Wakanda plus Miles Venom. And then you plan
Yeah, I think
on,
I'd rather go full Wakanda Venom Valkyrie.
I can see that, but since you're playing a exactly one extract scenario, I really like taking Miles for the force drop. So that if you lose the luck of the dice on trying to find the ship core, you just have Miles go over there and kick the guy. And then you
Yeah,
get it.
my thing is like Miles, and you have more experiences than me. Like Miles outside of Web Warriors just has a hard time getting to the point where he can like get in range, drop the thing, and pick it up for me. That's 4 power he's got to sit on, right? So he's got to be able to long move into range. It's just not my favorite personally. I feel like that's one of those things that always sounds nicer in paper than it actually plays out in execution for me.
Yeah, it
Um,
depends on how slow the game is. Like, if people aren't picking up the ship core until like round 3, he can pretty reliably do that because at that point he's saved up enough to do a web swing kick into somebody, which probably
well, that's
generates him
assuming
3 or
that
4
you're. I
power.
mean, sure, but the flip side of that is like, okay, if we're not picking up the core to round 3, like, why is Miles saving all this power? Why isn't Miles trying to pick it up?
Yeah,
Right? Like,
That's fair.
I move up, I don't pick up the core, and you're like, ha, got him. Miles is just gonna pass, save that power, right? Like Miles really should be trying to pick up the core there himself to prevent that from happening. And that's why, like, I get where you're going, and that's where my mind went the first time I saw Miles. I'm like, this is gonna be great. But actually playing with him in execution, I've just found that there are more limiting factors to getting him the power and in range in order to beat these things down, normally speaking, right?
Yeah. I
And if you're playing against Miles, don't attack Miles unless you have to. Because literally, if you give Miles 2 or 3 power in like round 2 or something, it changes all of his like trajectory and the things he can do in the map. It gets a lot worse for you. So if you attack Miles, you need to be prepared with some redundancies and things in order to handle it, if that makes sense.
yeah, I think you're definitely right here. Yeah, so I think Wakanda's definitely the less played team here overall, and I think that means, which we're going to get to in a second, that we're probably going to be taking away from the Wakanda side of the team and just keeping in that like bare minimum Wakanda wave team.
Yeah, I think we could drop Killmonger as weird as that sounds.
Yeah, so why don't we just hop on over into actually before we get to that, let's just talk about 3 hypothetical scenarios. We've already kind of covered bits and pieces of this. Um, but how do you feel about hammers plus gamma wave? You're so
I,
this could be
I think
18
we
or
need to
15.
circle back and evaluate, can Web Warriors play Gamma Waves themselves, or do we have to play Wakanda Wave here? I don't know. Like at a high level, I understand. I mean, the big ones we're worried about, right, is Cabal Modoc versus Wakanda Wave versus Web Warriors at 15. And I understand that that's like a weird pseudo nuanced game that I don't fully get because I don't main any of those and I haven't played a lot of them. My brain says that Web Warriors struggles at 15 either into Wakanda or into the Modoc Cabal list. That's what my brain says.
Yes, I think that is quite possibly one of the worst matchups. Uh, well, actually, the number one worst matchup, as an aside, is Web Warriors into any team that includes Venom. Venom will just straight up one shot any of the Web Warriors characters that isn't Venom. Um,
Yeah, and
but
that's I mean
outside
that's
of
why
that,
Venom's in like my roster right now. So if we're seeding that we have to play Wakanda if we're playing Gamma Waves, right? Then if we see an 18 to 15 flip, right, we have to play Wakanda. Um Wakanda at 18 is fine. I mean, I don't mean to like blip over it. I'm not speaking ill of it. Wakanda's a good list. Wakanda Wave is a good list. I don't want to belabor the point because it's been talked about on so many
yeah, yeah,
podcasts for so long. It's a very powerful list. Like Wakanda has been forgotten, not forgotten, but like they're not new, they're not shiny. They haven't had anyone add it to their affiliation anytime soon. So people are
yeah.
playing with.
This is definitely a Web Warriors focused list that's trying to use Wakanda to plug up one of the bigger
Yeah.
holes in its game.
Wakanda is like a very efficient, reliable thing. So yes, I would feel good with hammers and gamma wave for Wakanda.
Herbs plus extremists. I feel like I've played this a number of times at I think both 15 and 17 as Web Warriors, and I've been pretty happy with it. I haven't felt the need to play a Wakanda team here.
I think it's fine. You and I disagree a little bit on how reliably you can score the herb, but I think Web Warriors does just fine here.
Yeah, I might be overestimating it. Like I said earlier in the episode, I have a hard time telling like what the quote unquote solved Web Warriors game is going to look like. And I think herbs goes down the more people have seen what happens.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons that I could argue for herbs to be removed from this, but we can get back to that later.
Yep. And then we've got alien ship plus infinity formula. So this is going to be either 20 or 17. But I think either way, you want to play Web Warriors, and that's going to come into our roster shakeup in a sec. Is how do we build a better 20-point team for Web Warriors? Because that's definitely a pain point in the roster as constructed.
I think building a better 20-point team is important, and I also think it's important to consider whether or not you want to be playing alien ships. I understand that having the high value extract for the Venom Blast is really powerful. I don't know that Web Warriors likes to be playing at 20 that much.
Yeah, that's definitely valid. That's why I put Thor in, is you can kind of like crank up the points value without massively increasing the body count.
Yeah, I mean, you need someone else though to really amplify that though, right? Because I'm Web Warriors 10, right? The solid 10. I'm Peter Parker to 14. I'm Thor to 19. So then I
Yeah.
dropped Parker, and I'm in a weird spot where I had 2 more characters, but then I lose my affiliation. So again, I know we're gonna talk about this, but, like, I think we need to consider whether we wanna play ships, and either way, I think we need to go back and kinda tune up the 20.
Yep. Yep. So with that, why don't we switch over into quick changes? So we're just going to go through 0 to 1 character swaps, 0 to 1 tactics swaps, and 0 to 1 crisis swaps. And I think we've got something we want to change for each of these. So why don't we start off with characters? I think we're both in agreement that Killmonger is the first character that gets cut here.
Yeah, which is kinda crazy, right? I mean, the internet, like, the internet knows I'm not the biggest Killmonger fan, but he's still a very, very powerful character. I do think this makes some of your Wakanda wave lists worse by dropping Killmonger, so I think that's an interesting thing to really evaluate. But I do think that he's kind of the clear one of this that ends up kinda dropping out. So who do you see sliding in behind him?
My favorite 4 letter character, Wong.
I mean,
Uh,
he won't be legal for the first TTS.
he won't be legal for the first league, or well, he won't be legal for the first half of the league. But I think the fact that he hands out power and web warriors are so terrible at having power makes him incredibly valuable. Failing that, I've had some success with Rocket. You could also put Ock back in. I think he synergizes perfectly fine.
So I
Uh,
don't think any of those things you just mentioned shows up our 20-point list, right? So when I'm thinking of swapping a character out personally, I want to address the 20-point need that we've identified first, right?
yeah. Okay.
Like
Well,
I
then
think that all of those
actually
characters
I've got a
have
banger
good.
then.
Oh, a banger. Ooh, I like sausages.
Green Goblin.
Green
Get drop off
Goblin.
in there, baby.
So then what would the list be?
It would be Miles, Green Goblin, Venom, Thor, and that's 16. And then you take Peter.
Yeah, you'd have to take Peter for it.
Yep.
I think that's fine. I think Goblin's an interesting choice. I'm gonna throw one out there that people are gonna kind of laugh at. They're gonna kind of scoff at, and that's fine. You guys can all f off. I'm gonna toss out Ebony Maw or Doctor Strange. Um, I wasn't gonna talk about Doctor Strange because he's not legal at the time of recording this, but you kind of already
Yeah,
mentioned
I was about to
Wong.
give you guff for that.
I mean, that's the only reason I mentioned him. So the reason I'm tossing Ebony Maw out there. So humor me here for a second, right? He still ends up with a very, very powerful throw rate. I know he can only throw terrain at people here. He brings mystic attacks to your roster, which I believe otherwise you are sorely lacking there. He is good at generating his own power. He has some interesting movement shenanigans. And then when we get into the next one, when we're talking about power cards coming in here, he's a great advanced R&D target early.
Yeah. So why don't we just swap over into tactics? I think so. We definitely want to pull a Wakanda specific card, which means realistically Vibranium Shielding, which is a nice to have, but it isn't a must have when you're playing Wakanda Wave.
Yeah, and I personally would just swap that out for advanced R&D. It's one of the we talked about how power starved web warriors can be early. You can really open up some interesting lines of play with the advanced R&D. It also allows you, let's pretend character X spikes and they're sitting on a glut of power all of a sudden. It allows you to take that and distribute it to the rest of your team, right? So I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, I think advanced R&D is something you definitely want to try and slip into any Web Warriors roster. It really opens up your opening play options, which makes you more unpredictable and therefore more able to get an early advantage.
We could definitely do drop off. I know you mentioned sliding in Goblin. If we have Goblin, then what we have Goblin and Thor. I don't know that we're taking them often enough for me to want to take drop off. For me to take a tactics cards, I want to see it in more than half of my games.
Yeah, so if you were to do that Goblin swap, then your 17 point uh, team would be
Well,
Miles, Gwen, Venom,
it'd be the
Goblin,
Spider.
Shuri.
Yeah, it'd be the Spider 10 Goblin and Shuri is what I
Yep,
imagined as well, right? But then, I mean,
which is
I
a
get it.
very
Like
solid
dropping off Venom is like
17, but
powerful. I get it.
yeah.
It's just that's just kind of my caveat there. Is like we're planning on playing Wakanda for at least a couple of these scenarios. They don't really utilize it, so you could convince me into it because it is such an insanely powerful card. Um, but it also kind of conflicts to me with like the identity we're trying to achieve here. A lot of times, right? We're not trying to beat people down. It is a great positioning fixer, and you can definitely project some interesting area threat there. But when I think of drop off, I still think of like aggressive lists, tempo lists that want to
Yep.
kind of get up early on beats and not let up. And while we can do that, there are definitely other affiliations and other rosters that kind of exemplify that a little bit more.
Yep. And then let's quickly go into the crises. Um, and so you are in favor of cutting out alien ship or herbs. Um, and I'm assuming whichever one comes out, you're putting in hammers.
Nope, I actually really want to put in Spider Infected Invade Manhattan.
Oh yeah. No, I can see the case for that one too.
Controlling that for the short movement on enemy characters can just be like backbreaking sometimes, right? Like they come in with their beaters, they get in there, but not just go over there. Like
Yep.
move away. I think it's something that the web warriors can kind of recover from a little bit easier. And I like that scenario. It's also very live, obviously, with 5 different points out there. Now there is that kind of weird thing where you can't hold more than one, and there's 5 of them. But I still really
Yeah, but you're probably not getting more than 3, and if you're capable of getting more than 3, the game's over. At
yeah,
least
I
that's how
really
I've
like
seen
it.
it.
And again, I think that random short movement that's going to happen 50% of the time, right? Is to me very powerful against a lot of the aggressive beater teams there, right? Like, does
Yeah.
Modoc want to hold a spider person?
Nope. Though typically wherever he would be picking it up from, a lot of his neighbor because he tends to live in a bunker of support. One of the support characters will just pick it up, probably Skull.
Right, but it comes into an activation thing there, right? And a lot of times Modoc is the one kind of blasting it off, right?
Yeah.
And then it's who's going to pick that up. Are you going to leave it on the ground? Are you going to pick it up and put the thing on Modoc? To me, it just creates some interesting dichotomy there.
Yeah. So I guess so spiders come in. Are you cutting alien ship or Wakandan herbs?
Personally, I would get herbs. Like I said, we've done a couple different things to shore up that 20. I'm just not in love with herbs. You've played more than I am, so I think when I make a roster, I always assume that my opponent is as informed and as knowledgeable about what I'm doing as I am. And I think with that in mind, I think we both agree that herbs kind of takes a step down.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my jollies in before people realize what's going on.
Right. And I think that's perfectly fine. And that comes back to I talked about it across the Bifrost, like identifying what your goal is when you're making or building an individual roster. And if you just want to have fun and leverage something new, I think that's a great plan. I know herb isn't new, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But for me, I think herb would be the one that would come out.
Okay, well, I think we've covered pretty much everything. So just to kind of wrap it back up, uh, Killmonger comes out, Vibranium Shielding comes out, and uh, Herbs probably comes out, and then there's a bevy of options for how you want to bring those in. Um, for those of you who aren't watching the YouTube version of this, I'll be posting the full roster and the roster code for it in the description of the podcast wherever you pick it up from so that you can put this into assemble yourself and give it a go. Uh, thank you again for joining me, TT, and have a good evening.